lecture hall. It is my pleasure to welcome Professor Haya Schulmann, who is here this evening to deliver the third lecture of our Frontiers in Science lecture series. With Frontiers in Science, we want to take up the current developments within the field of international cutting-edge research and convey them to a broad, multidisciplinary audience within our university public. Each semester, a renowned researcher joins us to discuss their work and its implications for the 21st century challenges in science, politics, and society. Together, we explore leading questions, theories, and methods pushing scientific boundaries. For today's lecture, Frontiers in Science lecture, we are grateful to the Else Kröner-Fresenius Center for Digital Health at TU Dresden for supporting this event with a generous sponsorship. At work, as well as in our private lives, we are surrounded by both the potentials and risks of digital technologies. We just talked about it before we came here. In professional settings, digital advancements streamline processes, enhance communication, and facilitate global collaboration. Meanwhile, in our personal spheres, these technologies offer convenience, entertainment, and instant access to information. Yet, intertwined with these benefits are the looming risks. Cybersecurity threats, data breaches, and privacy infringements that constantly remind us of the fragility of our digital ecosystem. While the integration of technology into our daily routines has become ever more seamless, this escalating dependency comes hand in hand with amplified concerns. New vulnerabilities have formed, emerging as potential entry points for cyber attacks and exploitation. As we navigate this intricate digital landscape, the need for robust security measures and vigilant awareness has never been more critical. Given the urgency of this matter, we are honored to host Professor Schulmann this evening as she shares insight on digital advancements and increasing cyber threats. Haya Schulmann serves as a full professor at Johann Wolfgang Goethe Universität Frankfurt, where she holds a prestigious Loewe Excellence Professorship. She also spearheads the analytics-based cybersecurity mission within Athene, the German National Research Center for Applied Cybersecurity, as well as serving as scientific co-leader of the Fraunhofer Innovation Platform for Cybersecurity at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Notably, Haya Schulmann is also a driving force behind the German-Israeli Partnership Accelerator Program in Darmstadt and Jerusalem. Her research interests cover all aspects of systems and network security, vulnerabilities in the Internet's infrastructure and services, and design defenses. She has received numerous awards, including the Checkpoint Award in the ICANN Fellowship and the Microsoft Azure Research Award. In 2021, Haya Schulmann was awarded the German IT Security Prize by the Horst Goerz Foundation, Germany's most prestigious IT security award for the development of the cache test security solution. Dr. Schulmann, we are delighted to have you here this evening. Just a moment. And now I would like to give the floor to Professor Florian Schorsch, who holds the professorship for privacy and security here at TU Dresden, and who will give a short introduction to Haya Schulmann's field of research and the role it plays at TU Dresden.
Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to provide a very brief introduction to the topic of today's talk. I will start with the Internet, and as it originally was designed, it embraces the so-called end-to-end principle. The end-to-end principle is a concept that shaped its backbone, architecture, and enabled innovation and openness. The principle applies or implies that application-specific functions should be at the edge of the network, keeping every intermediate node very lean and very simple. In other words, the network was designed to remain a simple general purpose infrastructure pushing complexity to the edges. The approach fostered remarkable flexibility and scalability, and that is the reason why, in my opinion, it is the success that it has become. Decades later, we are still grappling with these consequences, with the consequences of these design decisions, often relying on retrofitting solutions, and this feels more like patching the system. For those of us who are working in security and privacy, this is a very familiar challenge, actually. It reinforces a very critical lesson. We should include security and privacy from the very beginning and not as an afterthought. And that leads to a very integrated design process. At TU Dresden, and in particular at TU Dresden's Center for Interdisciplinary Digital Sciences, the KIDS, this principle lies actually at the heart of its concept. By directly linking research, services, transfer activities through a very close association of interdisciplinary and integrative departments, it bundles the strength of TU Dresden. And it bundles the digital services. This approach also allows us to tackle very critical challenges from a very holistic point of view, producing results that bridge both academic results and practical domains. Initiatives like the SCATS AI and Synosys are two large-scale projects under the umbrella of KIDS and are very much prime examples for what can be achieved if this integration is prioritized. Today's talk will reflect this spirit. It delves into a cornerstone of our digital world, and that is internet routing and the ongoing efforts to secure it. Specifically, it will tell a story of the so-called Resource Public Key Infrastructure, or for short RPKI, security mechanism designed to address vulnerabilities. While initially insecurities wasn't a major concern for the infrastructure in the early days, nowadays it became a critical global infrastructure and the priorities have drastically shifted. So today's journey will go from the hurdles to an innovative proposal for more resilient architectures and will provide valuable insights into this story. Hence, we are very fortunate to have you here, Haya Schulmann, with us today to guide us through this journey. Haya is a renowned security expert and known for her work in network security in general and very specifically on the domain name system, DNS, yet another very important pillar of today's infrastructure on the internet, and also internet routing. Her work has uncovered critical vulnerabilities and therefore significantly contributed to the internet's architecture and in particular securing this architecture. That said, it is a pleasure to welcome you and now to leave the stage to you. Thank you.
So, thank you very much for the invitation. It's really great to be here. I'm delighted. Thank you for the generous introduction, the Rector, Professor Staudinger, Prorektor Research, Professor Rosen-Wolf, and thank you for this Einführung, Professor George. Yeah. Today I will give you a little bit... Yeah, right. Oder, Moment. Ich denke, das ist besser. So today, I will give you a little bit of an overview of the challenges that the internet is facing and focusing on internet routing. And geht nicht. Wenn es geht, das ja. Genau. And we start with what I do in general. So overview, what kind of research we do in my group. Yeah, danke. Thank you. So what kind of research we do in my group, and what kind of topics we cover. Here are some examples. So this is my group at the Goethe University in Frankfurt. We are part of Athene Center, the research center. We cover all the aspects of cybersecurity, and from internet security systems, security, communication, networking. We do large-scale studies. We try to take our research and the methodologies that we developed and really transfer them to real life and, for instance, do analysis of the digitalization in Germany, how the digital transformation look, how the digital systems look, what are the security problems and challenges, what are the vulnerabilities. We work on deployment of cryptography, post-quantum crypto, distributed protocols. We do analysis of the darknet, and of course topics which are now relevant, like cognitive warfare, hybrid threats, right? And we publish our work at top conferences, top security networking systems conferences, and in addition, I'm a member of Athene board, and I lead 3 research areas in Athene. I have a number of research projects which I started. One is Science Shield. This is a project that we do for BMBF in Germany on securing the universities and research in Germany. And another energy project in cybersecurity, which I am leading and working on with Israel, the Ministry of Energy in Israel and the DENA and BMWK in Germany on securing the energy sector and developing solutions against the threats there. Okay, so I'm engaged with the industry. I'm on advisories of Dresden, of Frankfurt. I work closely with different agencies in Germany, and we are trying to support with studies to inform the discussion and debate in different topics which are relevant to cybersecurity and digitalization in Germany, but also worldwide. You will see how our research affects also the strategy in the US, for instance. The research that I publish at top conferences are also often invited to be presented at top hacking conferences like Black Hat. They're reported in the register in Golem, and we try to then take our results from research and also write about them for the wide audience, like with the FAZ or Behördenspiegel, Tagesspiegel, Handelsblatt. So you can read a number of things that we wrote there, for instance, like Cybernation Deutschland, which was afterwards became a thing in Germany and is now led by the BSI. This is something we started and published in the FAZ 2 years ago. Another is definition of active cyberabwehr we also published. So a lot of the things that we do in our research, we see in our research, we publish this for the wide audience to inform debate, discussion, and to trigger topics. And today I will talk to you about internet and internet security. So just very briefly, internet is a critical infrastructure nowadays. Everything runs over internet. 90% of European population is connected to the internet. 67% of the world population is connected. It's a global network. We saw during COVID, and especially after COVID, this transformed how we work. We could work at home thanks to internet or from anywhere. We use a lot of applications which run over internet, and basically anything that we do runs over internet, and they run over cloud infrastructures or over communication infrastructure. So here are some examples, and it's extremely, extremely important. So if there is an outage, everything goes down. And here's 2 examples for an outage. One outage was a failed update. of a ISP, second largest ISP in Australia, which had a failed update overnight, which caused chaos and resulted in the fact that nearly half the population in Australia was without internet or telephone, and they could not do any payments, they could not use transportation, health systems went into chaos. There were train cancellations, surgeries were postponed, emergency calls were not possible. So this is just due to an outage which an ISP experienced. That is just one example. We see this often. If there is one problem, then many parts of the internet or services can be affected. So here's an example of a research we did in 2019, which research experiment which caused many of the internet networks to disconnect from the internet and caused a lot of problems as well. So this is just to motivate. Internet is critical. It's a critical system nowadays, and everything almost that we do runs over internet. If internet is gone, we have a big problem. So here before we dive into what are the problems, how it developed, and what is this internet? Let's say we want to go to some service in Athene. This is the National Cybersecurity Center in Hessen. And say you want to access a website of Athene, so you have a browser, it goes to a web server, and it needs to, the domain name of Athene, and you want to find an IP address, because everything in the internet works over IP addresses. Behind the scenes, there is a service which is called DNS. It's going to take this domain name and translate it to IP address. Now, routing in the internet is exactly the system which will help your communication go from one end, from the sender to the recipient. And that is the focus of our talk today. So how did this routing develop? I don't know if you can see the small words there, so I will tell you anyway about this, what this is. Internet started a long time ago, and many people think maybe it started in the 90s, 80s. It actually started. The history of the internet started probably 1969. Yes, there were some, before 1969, there was research related to this, but 1969, October, I think 29, 1969, is when the first message was transmitted. So the first network, it was, in 1969, ARPA awards contract to build the communication network. And the first connection was established between UCLA and the Stanford Research Institute. And they exchanged the first message between them. You can see in the slides, there's two, SRI and UCLA, and that was the first internet. And so 55 years ago, they set up a telephone connection to send the word log in. They wanted remotely to log in into a system, and the sender was a computer at UCLA, recipient was a computer at SRI. And the system was ARPANET, that was developed by the ARPA. This is the US Department of Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. And a programmer at UCLA tried to log in remotely, so they were typing the words and they were also talking on the phone. And I was saying I send an L, and the guys on the other end said, yes, I see an L. And now they said, I send an O, and he said, yes, I see an O, and then it crashed. And that was the first step. That was the revolution that started the internet that we have today. So this is how it started. This marked the significant milestone. Oh, man. And it grew. So it grew and more networks joined. You can see here, more networks joined, and more universities and more. I'm just jumping here in the years. 1982, you have about 100 nodes. And so initially there was just one core network, the ARPANET, and all the networks were directly connected to it. So there was not a need for a sophisticated routing protocol, since the network was just a tree. So you connect directly and you send your messages. But the network expanded and more universities joined. And as the network grew and more organizations joined, there was a need to support more complex ways to connect to one another. Yeah, the network might connect to each other and not only to the backbone, for instance. And so loops can be created. Topology became a mesh and not a tree. And they needed a protocol to support routing on these general topologies, to be able to communicate on these general topologies, and this is where BGP comes into play. So they developed BGP in 1989, and over time, internet grew, we see more networks join, and BGP adapted to address all the things that change. For instance, scalability. We have many more networks that are connected to the internet. It's not 100 nodes, now it's more than 100,000. Also, the business relationships have evolved. Providers wanted to provide connectivity services to their customers, so this all became more complex. This created a need to allow providers to pick a route that may not necessarily, that may be longer, not necessarily shorter, longer, but maybe because it's cheaper or has lower latency. And of course, also security concerns. BGP had to adapt to see this. So what we see is that BGP actually solves a difficult problem. It has to coordinate this competing and conflicting goals of different service providers, different entities, different parties that are connected to the network. And there is no agreement, no global agreement on what paths are good. So there is not like an entity which says this is how it should work, and this is exactly what BGP does. So how does this BGP work? It's very simple. The idea of BGP, and let's say we have a sender network. This is the origin AS. We have the destination network. This is the destination AS. AS is autonomous systems, and they want to communicate. So what happens is the protocol is simple. I advertise my path to my neighbors. They add themselves to the beginning of the path. They pick the path they like best. They advertise it downwards to their neighbors. And it is very, very simple, hop-by-hop-based path-based dissemination of routing information. And that's how it works in an abstract way. So if we have three networks connected to each other, and one network will send reachability information. So every network has a prefix range, which they own, or a number of prefix ranges, and so this AS3, this network will say to AS2, I own this prefix. If you have any packet with IP address within that prefix, you send it to me. And then you see on the one hand, in one direction, you have this control plane information, which says how to send packets to this IP address that network 3 owns, and then the blue large arrow, dick arrow, it sends the traffic. So this is the data plane. And then AS2 will add itself to the path and will tell AS1, okay, so to reach IP addresses within this prefix, you send to this network, to AS2 and then to AS3. You see passes 2, 3, and then they know, and this is how they will send. But the problem with BGP is very simple, but it has no security mechanisms. Any BGP router, any border router can claim prefixes it doesn't own. And what will happen is that the communication will be sent then to the wrong destination. So for instance, if you have an attacker, so this can happen as a mistake, but this can also happen as an attack. And if we have a network, attacking network, which says, I own this prefix, then if routers decide to use this announcement, they will send traffic to this IP addresses within this prefix to the wrong destination instead of the correct destination. You see, AS3 owns this prefix, but it will be sent to AS6. In this case, it's sent to AS6, for instance, because the path is shorter. So it will prefer to send to AS6 instead to AS3. So that's the core idea behind internet routing. This is how it works, and this is one of the problems in internet routing, that anyone can claim prefixes they even do not own. This happens a lot because of outages. There are many such outages, because of misconfigurations. There are many such misconfigurations. The system administrator, just as a mistake, use a wrong prefix. But this can also happen because of attacks, and such attacks are common. They come, a lot of such attacks, they're launched by ISPs in Russia or China, but also other states. So here are some example. You can see on the right side, on this side, an example that happened in real life. So there was a communication between Mexico and Washington, D.C., and this is the green files, arrows, and the red arrows are how the traffic actually was redirected. And you see the traffic goes through Moscow and then is sent back to the recipient so that no one notices this attack. And it went on for a number of months until it was detected. And indeed, it is very difficult to detect such attacks, but someone was picking up all this traffic and listening to this traffic as it was redirected. So you see, actually there was a lot of latency because it had to go to the other continent, but still no one detected the problem. Such attacks happen a lot, and here are a number of examples in addition to this example, and of course outages because of misconfigurations or censorship attempts which are not correctly done. And you can use such redirection for many goals, like eavesdropping. If you want to eavesdrop on what is sent, then you can read all the messages. Or denial of service. You can just block the communication because it will not go further. Censorship, you can direct traffic for financial gain. There were such attacks against cryptocurrency, redirecting the users to an incorrect website and then stealing their credentials and their cryptocurrency. You can do it for malware distribution, spam distribution, forging PKI certificates. So there are a lot of reasons why people do it, and indeed, typically nation states or criminals which can do such hijacks, control a BGP router, and this is a real problem. It's because of this problem, the a countermeasure was developed. It's called RPKI, and this is the focus, actually. This is the core of our talk today. So the problem in BGP, the core problem, is that anyone can claim to own any prefix in the internet. Any router can do this, and if the others believe him, then they will send traffic to the incorrect network instead of the correct network. And that is the core problem. And so what we need a public key infrastructure. We need to be able to validate who is the real owner of the internet resources. And here's a metaphorical example, a comparison to a public key infrastructure, which is a state. So we know a state is trustworthy, we trust the state, and state issues identity cards, signs the identity cards, and we can use these identity cards to prove our identity everywhere. Everyone can check, signature is correct, it looks like a real identity card, so then we can get services, for instance, or pay. And this is the core idea of PKI. So this is the core idea of PKI, and free source public key infrastructure is based on a PKI for network resources. The idea is that we have some authority as well, like the state, no something else. Regional internet registries. For our area, this is the RIPE NCC, and they own IP prefixes, and then they delegate these IP prefixes to organizations like Dresden University or ISPs, and they are the root of trust. So they can sign some certification which proves that we really own these IP prefixes. So if Dresden has an IP prefix, which Dresden has, it can issue a certificate which states, attests that Dresden actually owns this IP prefix. And now, when Dresden routers of the university in Dresden send their announcement to all the other networks in the internet, they can use these certificates and validate that the announcements are really correct. All the other networks in the internet can use these certificates and validate that it's correct. And here you can see this indeed. You see the validator. This is another part of the RPKI, which can retrieve the certificates and do the validation and indeed confirm, yes, this is really prefixes owned by this network. And that's the core idea. That's the core idea of RPKI, that you have certificates which attest to ownership of network resources, and everyone can validate this, the routing announcements against certificates and confirm that they are indeed correct. And this is meant to prevent such misconfigurations or hijack attacks where other networks announce prefixes which they don't, IP prefixes which they do not own. Now, certificates are stored at repositories, and these repositories are maintained by the regional internet registries. These are these RIRs. You remember it just showed the RIPE and the others, RIPE for Europe and North America and South America. We also have a repository here. You can see for Athene, we operate a repository here. So you can operate a repository yourself, or you can just place your certificates in the repository of the RAR. And what happens is that then every network installs such validator. It's just a module which can download the certificates, and validate them, give them to the router, and the router can use them to make routing decisions. Now, that is in a nutshell RPKI. And it prevents hijacks as follows. When the attacker now, we have AS6, the attacking network, it announces a hijacking announcement for a prefix which it doesn't own, because this prefix is owned here by AS3. So the validator, RPKI validator at the network 1 will validate the certificates and see that they don't match to the BGP announcement. He will not accept the announcement, and this prevents traffic hijack. This is quite critical. We saw how significant internet is, and this is really a big thing, this RPKI, because it allows to avoid all these misconfigurations, outages, and which happen because of when you enter incorrect prefix or because of intentional attacks. So let's look at 3 questions related to RPKI. Is this actually used? So we have the system, it was designed, it was standardized, it is implemented. Is it actually used? How many networks use RPKI? And then how many networks have certificates for their prefixes on the one hand? On the other hand, how many networks actually use these certificates and validate? And is it effective? Maybe we invest a lot of efforts into deploying something, building something which is not effective. Maybe on the paper it's effective, but in real life it's not effective. So that's what the questions that we'll consider. And first of all, how do we measure RPKIs? We look at, first of all, the certificates. So we can take certificates from the repositories, analyze them, and see how many there are. We did the first measurement of global certificates in 2017. And analyzed the errors in the certificate. So what we found is many certificates had errors. There were more than 10% of errors. And there were in 2017, there were about 6% certificates. For 6% of the internet prefixes had certificates, and more than 10% of them had errors. This means we found that many times the certificates is incorrect, which causes the traffic to be filtered. On the other hand, we found that some certificates were incorrectly configured. They didn't prevent attacks. So people didn't know how to do it correctly. It was a problem. And now the situation is bad. By the way, this was published at a top conference, a STAR conference, NDSS, and triggered also follow-up work of measurements of the certificates. Nowadays, on this site, you can see there are more than 50% certificates. This means this is getting deployed, people use it, people deploy it, and also the error rate is significantly lower, less than 1%. So that's improving. It takes people time to understand this, so the technology, and to start deploying it, but 8 years later, the situation is much better. So on the one hand, certificates are being deployed and other networks using them. And we did also the first experiment, developed the first methodology for measuring which networks actually validate these certificates against routing announcements. And the idea is that we use hijacking announcements. So you send hijacking announcements and you send real announcements, and you check if the routing changes. If it changes, then it could be because of validation. And if it doesn't change, then we assume that the network doesn't do filtering. And so at that time, when we did this research in 2017, we found, I think, that's in 100 large big ISPs, only one did such filtering in 2017. Nowadays, and this work triggered also follow-up work, and this methodology was improved, and the main challenge there is false positives. You reduce false positives, false negatives, and to improve your coverage and to make it more accurate. And so nowadays it's about 30%. Some measurements say a bit more, but overall it's about 30%. So we see this is also being deployed. So both ends, both the certificates are being used and the validation is being deployed and increases. Internet is becoming more protected. Is it actually with RPKI, and is it effective? Does it deliver on its guarantees? So we used a graph-based theory to analyze effectiveness of RPKI. So what we did, we developed two graphs using the internet graph, how traffic flows, and on one graph we used routers which did RPKI filtering, and on the other hand, those that didn't. And by analyzing the disconnected components that were created, we found that RPKI is effective, but depends where you deploy it. So for instance, there was a folklore belief if you have RPKI, RPKI filtering on the IXPs was effective. We found that it was only effective for blocking hijacks in local networks, but not globally. It doesn't block hijacking announcements in the global internet. To block hijacking announcements on the global internet, you need to deploy RPKI filtering in large ISPs. And actually, this recommendation in this study was also adopted in the US by the Federal Communication Commission and also by the White House in a recent roadmap that they did, which cite our research, refer to our research and for how strategy of adoption of RPKI should proceed. And you can see here, this is an excerpt that I took from the FCC fact sheet. So this paper was also published at a top conference. It was at USNIX 22, I think. And okay, so RPKI is getting deployed. It provides benefits. It is effective, but it has to be deployed in a clever way. Not everywhere it is effective. Should focus on large ISPs. And now it is gaining traction. And recently something happened in September 2024, so 2 months ago. The United States published a roadmap for improving routing security in the internet. And the White House said RPKI is critical for national security. So suddenly RPKI is not just an experimental research prototype, it has political significance. And this means that it's a huge thing. This means it's going to be even faster now deployed everywhere. And the White House said RPKI is a mature and ready to implement approach to mitigate vulnerabilities in the routing, inter-domain routing. And so what we did is we analyzed how is RPKI actually mature? We asked the question, is RPKI mature, a mature technology? Did we invest enough time and prepared to face really wide-scale deployment? So that's what I will show you. So the first thing we did is we did software analysis. As any technology, RPKI is also software. And we analyzed RPKI software. And we found many vulnerabilities, but the point is it's extremely challenging to analyze software like RPKI. You have fuzzers, for instance, for software analysis. But these fuzzers, they work on simple systems. Cryptography-based defenses are very challenging to analyze. There were no fuzzers available to analyze RPKI. And indeed, this is not surprising that there are so many problems. The developers of RPKI components, of RPKI software, have no tools to analyze their software. Is it secure? Is it stable? Is it resilient? So the first thing that we did is we developed an environment and a software tool for analyzing vulnerabilities in RPKI implementations. And here is a number of vulnerabilities that we found in this table. And on the big table and on the small table, you have a different categories. So basically what you can see, it's in many different aspects of RPKI. This is not just one system. And vulnerabilities were also in systems which use like standard libraries or develop proprietary libraries. So this is a problem. And FCC Federal Communication Commission, they also refer to this work, which was published at NDSS 2024. And what we see is that the developers of RPKI, they use our tools, and we made it open source to support improvement of RPKI software quality to make it more mature. Now, another aspect from this analysis is the observation that actually RPKI increases the attack surface. Now, that's an important observation, and the way it works nowadays is, the network says, okay, I'll try RPKI, and you deploy it on your network. It runs often in a test mode. You see that it doesn't ruin anything. This is the right way to do things, of course. But you know nothing about the software. You don't know if it's secure, if it's not secure. Many of the RPKI software is developed as open source. And in some of these projects, anyone can write code. Anyone can contribute. Anyone can inject backdoors. There is not so much supervision of who enters what code. And so the first observation is that actually RPKI, right, it is important, it improves routing security, but on the other hand, it also potentially exposes your networks to attacks. And here's an example that you can see that we found. A vulnerability in one popular RPKI component. Basically, over RCE vulnerability, over this vulnerability, you get access to the network. So before this work of ours, no one realized, at least not officially in research or in the internet, that RPKI, in fact, introduces a door to your network. So over an RPKI component, you can obtain access to the network and attack the network. But notice, because a lot of these RPKI projects, implementations, they are implemented by groups which are not very much funded, and on a voluntarily basis, the majority of the vulnerabilities, and there are no tools to check the software. The possibility to have vulnerabilities is immense, and indeed we found a lot of vulnerabilities. And indeed we also found vulnerabilities which look like intentional vulnerabilities, and some things, for instance, which you would not expect or don't fit to be there. And bottom line, we need much more supervision over the software of RPKI. When we deploy RPKI on our networks, we need to understand it has significance, not just for improving the routing, but it can also increase the attack surface, and it can also expose our networks to attacks. Therefore, the software has to be much more stable, there should be more tools, and there should be more certification over who can write code in RPKI and participate in the open source projects. We also found a lot of errors in RPKI deployments. So I'm not going to go over the list of what are the topics that we defined as maturity and what problems we found, but I'll just show you two issues. And one is the software extremely fragile and vulnerable, and on the other hand, errors in deployments. So people still lack expertise in deployments of RPKI. There are still errors, not just in certificates, but also in setups and misconfigurations. And what we find is, when we find these vulnerabilities, and the list that I showed to you, we work very closely with the vendors to patch these vulnerabilities. And there are patches for everything. We have a lot of CVEs registered, and there are a lot of patches. But we find that almost 50% of the deployed RPKI instances in the wild have not been patched. This means patch management and deployment of patches is also an issue in RPKI which needs to be addressed, which has not been considered. So if you notice, all the discussion in RPKI goes in the direction we have to deploy it, but not what does it mean for our network? Are we ready? Do we have the patch management? Do we have everything else like we do for other digital infrastructure? Right, so it's a Baustelle. It's not yet mature. And we wrote a paper, we asked, did actually the White House recommend a vulnerable system? Should we not deploy it maybe? And in fact, this is not so. Our answer is, if you look at the internet, and like how I showed you how routing developed, most of the systems in the internet, they started from experimental research prototypes. most of any system like FTP, email, everything that we use, they start not just routing. A lot in the internet, they started as experimental research prototypes, and they matured over time. So you cannot have an isolated ideal environment, have a software there, and do it in such a way that when you deploy it in the internet, it will be perfect. It will not work. This is how things work. So this is the correct way to do things. And we support the recommendation of the White House for wide deployment of RPKI. And it is done the way it should be done. We should deploy a system and they should mature gradually, but we need to also create conditions that it is like this. And I will tell you after I present our solution which resolves many of the problems, what are the main insights that we have for proceeding with RPKI and other internet protocols as well. So main two problems in RPKI validation is resilience and availability. These are the two main problems, and you saw with the different results that I showed that these are the key problems actually, whether it's vulnerabilities in the software or failures and errors, connectivity problems, availability and resilience. And what we did, we developed a system which is Byzantine secure RPKI, using ideas from distributed systems research, from distributed computing. We extended RPKI to develop Byzantine secure RPKI. The idea is that instead of having one component, you have a number of components which run a consensus among them, and they decide then in this consensus on the certificates and do the validation. So that's the idea, and here you can see that this is this network of these components, and they retrieve the objects and they run a consensus and make it available to the networks. This resolves the problems with the attacks, failures, errors, connectivity problems. Because if one is attacked, you can still have the other ones. And not only that, but also the performance is improved, and we remove the problems with the increased attack surface, with the access to your network. So until now, the most common deployment of RPKI is that you have to set up a validator which validates the certificates, and then you use it for your router. In our setup, in this consensus agreement-based RPKI, you don't need this. We have a setup which we already deployed, and we have universities which are using it. We are doing the validation in a resilient way, in a robust way, and the routers can just retrieve the validated certificate. So you actually don't need to install anything on your network. The latency is reduced. The latency, while researchers in the area of distributed computing often think that such protocols are not efficient. In fact, our prototype and setup is more efficient than the RPKI, the vanilla RPKI. And this was published at ACM CCS this year. This is also a top conference. And we have a running setup. So anyone is interested in trying this, you can configure your university to use this Byzantine secure RPKI objects to make your routing more secure without going through the risks. Now, perfect is the enemy of the good. This is actually something with which I will conclude. So what I asked before, did the White House push for adopting an immature technology? That's a good question. And I told you that actually this applies to many of the systems, almost all of the systems that we use nowadays, even the internet. It was an experimental technology which gradually matured or grew and into this largest commercial platform that we know. And RPKI is not different. So expecting full maturity before a system is deployed is not realistic. The realistic way to do is to start gradually and to deploy it gradually, exactly like it was done. And that works good enough, because look at routing. Started as an experimental research project, and nowadays it connects all this more than 100,000 networks in the internet, and it works pretty good. We have outages, we have problems. It is fragile, but on the other hand, resilient enough for internet to run. So the actually bottom line, main observation is that the standardizers, the IETF, they should use more systematic approach to validating security and potentially working closer with the research community. But this is the right way to go, and indeed RPKI is the solution to securing, making the internet routing more secure. And that brings me to the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Now it's on. Yeah, thank you very much for this exciting talk. I didn't understand everything, but at least I understood that there are still some open questions, but are also questions in the audience.
I think everyone understood.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you for the talk. It was really interesting. So how much does the development of quantum computing matter to this? I mean, the way you describe the Byzantine RPKI, it wouldn't matter because it's distributed, but does it? I mean, is there a thought on that?
Yeah, of course, RPKI is based on RSA and post-quantum or crypto agility is an important topic for RPKI. Like, how do you replace algorithms? So there are initial steps. There is one implementation which starts supporting one post-quantum algorithm, but it's not trivial. You know, integrating agile cryptography requires changing the systems the way they work now. And then changing this large scale is challenging. It exposes you also to attacks if you can replace algorithms. We did it in a different research where we showed that by making, we actually won a distinguished paper award at the CCS this year for that paper, that by making a system agile that you can replace crypto, you expose yourself to attacks like denial of service attacks, downgrade attacks. On the paper, it's very easy to do. You write a cryptographic definition, you prove it, and it's okay. Other challenges, let's say, not very easy, but other challenges. But deploying this theoretical academical solution in real life is a whole bunch of other problems, and it's a very important research. So what you are asking, deploying crypto agility or making RPKI post-quantum secure, it's a challenge, and it's not yet there.
Lacking experience and also expertise into getting into your core subject, I would like to ask a bit of different questions on that. You mentioned that there's this open door and open source all and everywhere, I think. Now, I would like to hear your recommendations on how to deal with that. I mean, we have open source all and everywhere, and I do fully agree to what you said of that being very vulnerable and making us very vulnerable. So would you have any recommendation on how to deal with that?
That's also a pain topic, of course, as you're saying. Open source is important, and we need, I think, as a state, to invest more in open source. There should be better supervision or certification. You know, who can write code in open source? Because it's so under-financed. You take anyone that is willing to take your time, you know, to invest in it. Like, then you get stuff like xzetutils, if you in the backdoor in the operating system. And that is a real threat, because a lot of states invest in this, and this is an attractive goal for them. It's an attractive target to attack open source. Everyone uses it. There are open source libraries in everything, in proprietary software. So if you can find a vulnerability or inject a backdoor in an open source, you can attack many targets over supply chain attacks, so to say. So that's a problem, and this can be improved. I think open source is important. As a community, we should have this, of course, as well. We need to invest more resources into this. States like Germany, other European states, the US, they should invest a lot in making open source more resource funded. And of course, there are different types of open source. Like, there are projects that really not funded at all, and there are projects which companies make open source, so that's a different story. I'm talking about those that are not funded. We need much more funding, and we need supervision to ensure that someone who writes code is really qualified and was vetted, his identity was vetted, that's not someone with a pseudonym can just start writing code. That's a huge problem, not just in RPKI, that is a big problem everywhere, and it's an important topic that we address as a society, and of course as a research society as well.
Why is it so difficult to make such attack visible? You have a much longer path, a big delay, and nobody see it for months. Is there no monitoring system that you can see there's an attack or not? One way is to prevent an attack. The other way would maybe to see if an attack happens and then make a decision.
Also, excellent question. Of course, you're right, but the problem is of big data. So you have a lot of data here. You have a lot of announcements, and routing can change the route, the path, also without malicious intent. It can happen suddenly. It's not fixed because maybe someone changes provider somewhere, or maybe because of other reasons. So I haven't mentioned, but BGP is kind of money-driven protocol in a sense, because it grew with this services between providers and customers, and so you have providers which provide connectivity to customers. Customers pay for that, and a lot of the agreements, how traffic goes, they are based on these financial contracts. So maybe you have a cheaper, a more efficient path, but you will still take a different path because of the agreements. And these agreements may change, and on the path somewhere it can change. So it can happen that routing, it does happen also, not so often, but it does happen. In the same day, routing updates multiple updates can be because without any malicious intent. So this happens. So how do you distinguish, how do you differentiate which updates are legitimate and which updates are malicious? And that is a challenge. Now, it's not just one link, right? Because you have the entire path. And there are services which look and try to find such changes and to determine are they malicious or not. There are also challenges there, because as long as we in the internet, in this digital era, as long as we have connectivity, everything works. For people, attack only happens when your data is encrypted or when you cannot reach a service, right? Or when your data is leaked somewhere. But otherwise, it all works okay. So as long as it worked here, why would you notice something? It's all good, you have the service, right? So the main aspect, and this is how internet was built, the main property that was the most important property is availability, connectivity. You have connectivity. As long as the attackers manage to preserve this connectivity, namely, they get the traffic to themselves, but then they redirect it, that it gets back to the destination, you will not notice anything. And there are services that try to detect this, and also during this attack there were already like BGP looking glasses and other things. It's very difficult to detect these things, very difficult to find, and more so the attacks, they develop themselves, they evolve, and these hijacks, they become even more raffiniert, advanced, sophisticated, right? They become more sophisticated, they become more difficult to detect. There are many different ways to do that. So it's not trivial, it's a topic of research. There is a lot of research to try to detect these things. So you can try to go in the direction, okay, I try to detect them, or you can try to go in the direction, I try to prevent them. And in RPKI, this is the direction which says, I just try to prevent them from the start because it's very difficult to detect. And another problem with these attacks, how do you determine if it's afterwards, once you detect it, how do you determine, is it a misconfiguration? Do I call this ISP up and I tell him, can you please stop hijacking my traffic? But what if they do it intentionally? And the problem with these resolutions, once you detect it, it's very challenging. It takes sometimes days to pull it back, and some states, they do it intentionally. Like often, for instance, hijacks come from China. And you tell them, can you please stop? And it goes on and goes, oh, we haven't even noticed that was happened. That's happened, So detection is an important direction. But if we do RPKI, we prevent it, because a lot of mechanisms which afterwards are based on or assume source authentication. RPKI actually authenticates prefixes. It tells you if you own this prefix, everyone can validate. Based on that, you can do a lot of other mechanisms, and they're being standardized and developed to validate the entire path. So if you have this, you will not even get into a situation that you need to call someone and convince them to stop hijacking your traffic. And let's say they want to sabotage. What happens if, like, we go into, the geopolitical situation is getting more verschärft? I'm actually not used to giving talks in English. So they are getting more critical, and so you will have more and more such attacks. And in some cases, we have even evidence of intentional sabotage, like of the cable that between Germany and Finland. So what happens if they do it intentionally, and you can ask them for as long as you want to stop, and they will not stop. So important direction, but we should focus also on prevention simply from the start.
Okay, thank you.
So I have a couple of questions, but they might be quite naive. But on the point about the Byzantine approach, and it's using, instead of a single validation approach, it's using distributed validation approaches. I didn't quite understand how that will actually help against a backdoor, which is in source code. Like, if all of the validation approaches all have the same backdoor, are they not all validating with a backdoor there, and you still get an attack? I have another two, but if you want to take them.
You mean for the distributed setup?
The distributed setup.
For the consensus. Okay, I'll tell you. That's a good point. And because you use a number of instances, right? So you can have maybe a backdoor or a vulnerability. So a backdoor is actually a vulnerability, not just intentionally injected. And yeah, it's not on your, first of all, the distributed setup is not on your network. It's on some other network. You just connect to it and download validated certificates already. This is the first thing. Of course, it can happen in the future that there will be vulnerabilities, or maybe now exist, and in the future they will be found. In the open source, we have a lot of vulnerabilities like Heartbleed. We have access to open source, and we all saw this code, but no one noticed Heartbleed or Log4j or other. So in any software, there are a lot of vulnerability, and making software secure is a fundamental problem which exists since the 80s or even before, and still has not been resolved. There could be vulnerabilities, and that is the point, that if you have multiple instances, even if you attack one of them, or crash one of them, or one of them has an outage, the other ones still work. The idea in distributed computing is that as long as you have a majority which still compute correctly, perform correctly, even if one was attacked or failed or is malicious because it had a backdoor and now it turned malicious and start validating the certificates incorrectly, you can still preserve security. That's the basic core idea, the key idea, and this is the idea that we use here. You can see there are multiple instances. Maybe one became corrupt and malicious, and now it just says invalid certificates are valid, or tries to invalidate certificates. The others will ignore him because as long as the majority is correct, you can still preserve correctness of your scheme.
Okay, I've got a very different second question. If unless somebody else is, you're trying to ask. Actually, Kai is trying to ask.
No, please.
Okay. Like in terms of one of the points was about a lot of internet service providers not being set up to do things securely. Is it possible in the political way that the internet works and the way that this flow of money works, that it actually costs them more money to not be secure, such as the fees that they can get or the fees they have to pay are proportionate to their degree of security and the degree of correctly setting up that security? So I imagine if it was, one could very quickly result in a situation where most people are secure because it pays to be secure, or is that not the way it works politically?
No, absolutely. So my answer is twofold. That's a good question, and my answer is twofold. On the one hand, yes, you need to create incentives to deploy security mechanisms. And for ISPs or any other organization, money drives deployment. We need to create incentives that would drive deployment, would motivate them to make themselves more secure, to deploy security mechanisms. So this is one. This means when we design security mechanisms, we have to think about this in advance and design them in such a way which says, if you use this, you attract more traffic, for instance. Then they would deploy it. And on the other hand, on a social level, I think, and possibly it's not just in Germany really, is the idea that people think that security costs you money. It does cost you money, but we need to think about it as an opportunity, that you should be able to make more money with security. So that's a mindset, I think. So first, we should not see security as a cost factor. And on the other hand, we should develop mechanisms in such a way that they will bring financial benefits if you deploy them. In any sense, like if you take routing, that you have a mechanism which attracts more traffic because ISPs make money when they get more traffic. This is the financial agreements of the interdomain routing BGP. So if you deploy a security mechanism, you get more traffic. I'm sure everyone would be supporting a security mechanism, right? Because you get more money, so that's their core business. So yes, it should be done. It can be done, and it should be done. We should look in this direction. We should remember also that the internet developed from the beginning. It was not a commercial platform. It was an experimental research project, which escaped from the lab and became this critical infrastructure or a huge commercial platform. So that's why the mechanisms from the scratch were not designed with this mindset. But now it is, and now we should look at it this way and design mechanisms in such a way.
Thank you.
So thank you for the great talk. Can you elaborate a little bit on the overhead that RPKI in general and maybe also your Byzantine RPKI induces on the systems? So how many pressure with respect to, I don't know, traffic, computation, whatever, does it induce?
Also a good question. I like questions, actually. It depends. That's the answer. Because nowadays, not really, because it's not widely deployed. An interesting question would be if we extrapolate what happens when RPKI will have been fully deployed and everyone is signed, then you would imagine actually that there will be quite a lot of traffic going on. And this is one of the concerns that I told you is on the list, but I haven't told you because the list is long. And like Fermat said, the margins are short, and so I just told you with the software and the errors. But it is a concern. When RPKI will be fully deployed, we'll have a problem. We'll have to send a lot of traffic. And there will be a lot of computation for these validators that will have to be computing all the time. Now, there are many details that I haven't talked about. Like, for instance, they need to download these objects periodically because they become stale. So a network maybe owned a prefix, but now it sold it, so it needs to, the certificate will not be valid anymore, so you need to invalidate the certificate. So what these validators do, they download it periodically. And then the question, how often should they do it, right? So there are different choices which implementers make, how long this should be. But the point is, if you have RPKI fully deployed, then they will be just busy computing. They will not even manage to download in each interaction, in each round, all the objects. So that is a problem. It's a problem that has to be addressed. And currently, RPKI doesn't introduce a lot of overhead because it's not done on the router. There was one of the reasons it's not done on the router, this download of objects, because if your router had to download objects, validate cryptography, and then in addition to computing its forwarding table, it would have been flooded, of course. So that's why they separated it. You have cryptography separately from the router. It downloads the objects and validates and then sends to the router. Your network doesn't experience any latency because of this. There is a lot of stuff that is being sent and received, but now it's not critical. It will be critical when it's more deployed than now. Now, our solution improved this efficiency, because nowadays what you have is every network uses these validators and every network downloads it for itself. So you will have already now, but you will have quite a lot of stuff being sent back and forth and validated. In our setup, it is so that just our setup, let's say for Germany, because digital sovereignty is one of the main topics as well now for the politicians, and every country wants to control its own IT, its own software, its own deployment. So let's say you have this setup for Germany, that's what we did, and all the networks in Germany downloaded from us. This reduces significantly the traffic in the internet, because they don't have to go to every repository, every validator to go to every repository in the internet. And that would be quite a lot. In this case, you just do it to our setup, you download it, so you reduce the load on the network. And you also reduce the load on all these computations that validators need to do. So it improves significantly the performance for the internet as a whole. If you're into green things and you're saying we have to have green internet, that reduces a lot of that and makes the internet greener. And the performance is, of course, better and will be in the future when RPKI is fully deployed. Mm-hmm. So I'm sure, actually, that in the future, when RPKI is fully deployed, this is the setup that will be used, that we published in this paper and our setup that we have. So you can start already using it now and not wait until RPKI is fully deployed and your network is flooded.
Thank you. So, by the way, I wouldn't care too much about hijacking attacks using a secure cryptographic protocol like IPsec, despite denial of service, of course, and that's from that point of view, it's a good idea from an infrastructure point of view to have such a protocol. But my question is, what do you think the IETF could do better in terms of making things more secure? Because most, if not any, of the problems you've shown are implementation problems, even these stupid buffer overflows. And I don't think so that IETF could control this implementation part. On the other hand, of course, it's a good idea to have secure protocols and validation of process of protocol security.
So, can I disappoint you? IPsec or secure channel will not help you, right? Because how do you get certificates, right? You have to go to a CA to issue a certificate. If I hijack your traffic, and there were such attacks, prefix hijacks to issue fraudulent certificates, your IPsec will be worthless, because you will not know who you communicate with, right? You will have a certificate which is valid, and you will be communicating to the attacker. So there were attacks, indeed, in which nation-state attackers attacked certificate authorities to issue fraudulent certificates. Using prefix hijacks is a very popular way to do it. And then, you can use IPsec, you can use SSL TLS, but you will be communicating with the attacker, and you will not even know this because you'll have no error messages. The certificate is valid. So, therefore, I argue IPsec is not a solution to prefix hijacks. And SSL is not a solution. And another problem, this was just one problem by attacking CAs, and CAs are target of attacks. Certificate authorities, this is the state which we trust that issues certificates. In the digital world, they are called certificate authorities. On the other hand, think about denial of service. If someone just wants to prevent you from communicating, and think about the third part is metadata. Do you know how much you can learn from a metadata? When you communicate, with whom you communicate, what the packet sizes are. Just based on this information, you can learn a lot of information about which systems you use, about which information you send even. So this statistical analysis. So first, think about certificate authorities. Second, think about attacks which block your traffic. Third, think about traffic analysis. And I hope I convinced you that this is not a solution to prefix hijacks. Now that was first part.
We can talk about that. It's not a solution for all problems, but it's a solution for my private networks and when I run my own CA. I trust my own CA.
But your internet is not just your private network, right? I'm sure you want to access your bank, right? You want to access your bank account. You want to access services over the internet. You want to access the cloud. Things are being increasingly outsourced to the cloud. You have things there. You cannot put your own certificate everywhere. This is not so a solution really would be a secure routing. And other things, they are patches. They don't solve all the problems. Many of the problems still remain. And therefore, I think the best way to go is really to secure this. Now, on the other hand, with the IETF, I was much more involved in the IETF as I was younger. Now I'm older. And it was a challenging thing. It's not a trivial thing. And to be active in IETF. So I'll tell you from my experience, when you are young and you're a woman and you have their old timers that built the internet, what do you understand? They know everything better. So it's difficult. It's not easy. And but I think it is improving. I'm not so much active in the IETF anymore. I'm focusing on the research side of things and working with the industry or strategies. But I think IETF should do more systematic analysis for things. I think one of the problems that we have with IETF is the main thing that comes from IETF are standards, RFCs, right? So look at RFCs. If you look at RFCs, you will see how work at IETF is done. One system often has many RFCs. Let's say a system like routing or like DNS or DNSSEC, you have 50 RFCs. What does it mean? This means they don't, of course, these are complex systems, but this means these things were not thought through from the beginning. This means people write something and then we overlooked this, now let's write another RFC which obsoletes this RFC, and now let's write another RFC. So if you have, for DNSSEC, you have more than 50 RFCs. Can you imagine what it means for an implementer to implement this? Of course there are vulnerabilities. Of course you cannot keep track of everything that was in one RFC and then you went to the next RFC and then this is a nightmare. So this shows this alone. Can you imagine you write a paper, you publish it at a conference, then you notice, oh, actually my proof was incorrect, and I publish again. Oh, actually there I forgot something. Now you publish again, and then you have 50 papers for the same topic. You would not imagine this in academia, right? So this means they need to work more systematically. I think they do very important work. I think it's very good what they do, but I think they need to approach things from a more systematic perspective. And we need to be patient with RFCs, not to publish, so many. So that would be my recommendation.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much. My impression is that there's still a lot to be done. You have a question, sorry. Yeah.
Just one question, returning to the open source topic again. When everybody basically remembers the XEU tools back in April, and you say you'd prefer some form of authenticated developer contributing to this, wouldn't you say, for example, that if we required companies that benefit from open source stacks to contribute to the repositories they benefit from, that this would basically solve both your issues? You'd have more people contributing their work, as well as them being in some form already validated or authorized by, or at least trackable, as you know where they come from.
So that was the answer, actually, no? What you said. I think, we should do this, and the open source is not the same. There is open source, there's open source, and some open source is more secure, some open source is less secure. I think it has to be also more kind of systematic, more supervision, more vetting, and more investment. And there are companies which do open source projects. They're actually more secure than open source project on GitHub, right? So we need to maybe as a community decide which kind of projects, systems, topics are important and invest in them. You cannot invest in everything open source and support it, but those that are important, we can decide a number of goals and focus on them and die hochzuziehen.
Okay, thank you.
So, a last question? Obviously not. So, thank you very much. It was really exciting because I learned a lot, and my impression is that there is still a lot to be done, but we are on a good way, and my fear that our IT system crashes tomorrow is a little bit low. Okay, thank you.
Danke. Thank you very much.